Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into something complex. The interplay between culture, religion, and poverty in India.
Yeah, it's definitely a sensitive topic, and it's got layers. We've looked at quite a range of sources to try and understand it better.
Right, we've got studies, surveys, things like the Indian Human Development Survey, NSSO data, World Values Survey, plus news analysis and research from places like Pew.
Exactly. And our mission, really, is to pull out the key arguments and the data points. How might culture and religion factor into poverty while also keeping, the big economic and social drivers firmly in view?
Okay, so where do we start? I guess the caste system feels pretty fundamental.
It really is. It's this historical hierarchy rooted in Hinduism that traditionally dictated social roles, economic roles, and its impact, lingers.
It definitely seems to. The data we saw from the IHDS, the Indian Human Development Survey from 2004-2005, that really showed some stark gaps, didn't it?
Absolutely stark. You look at monthly spending per person, that's the MCE, monthly per capita expenditure. In rural areas, high-caste Hindus were at about, RS 1037? Compare that to scheduled castes at RS 657 and scheduled tribes way down at RS 511.
Wow.
And you see a similar pattern in the cities, too. Maybe not quite as extreme, but it's there.
It makes you think, how do these old social divisions still shape people's wallets today?
Well, and it's not just about current spending, is it? It seems to affect sort of the potential for improvement, too.
Yeah, that point about education really struck me. Getting a matric-level education, so like finishing secondary school. It added, RS 407 to a high-caste Hindu's monthly spending, but only RS 294 for someone from a scheduled caste.
Exactly. So the same educational achievement seems to yield less economic benefit depending on your caste background.
Why is that, do you think? Is it just barriers?
It strongly suggests systemic barriers, yeah. Maybe discrimination in hiring, maybe less access to those crucial networks, social or professional.
Right.
And the IHDS researchers actually tried to quantify it. They estimated the caste system explains about 11% of the inequality in that monthly spending figure.
11%, that's significant.
It is, in both rural and urban areas. And look at who ends up in the bottom 20%, the poorest households.
Okay.
Rural areas, 8% of high-caste Hindus, but 23% of scheduled castes, and a massive 45% of scheduled tribes.
45%, that's almost half.
Almost half. Urban areas show a similar disturbing trend. It really challenges the idea that just individual effort is enough, you know?
Absolutely. Okay, so that's a caste angle. What about just looking at religious groups overall? There seemed to be a pattern there too, particularly regarding Muslims.
Yes, that came through pretty consistently across different data sets and time periods. Muslims generally appear to have a lower economic status compared to other major religious groups.
So what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, back in 2009-2010, NSSO data showed Muslims' average daily spending per person was around RS 0.32.66. Compare that to Hindus at RS 37.5 Niru, Christians higher at RS 51.43, and Sikhs highest at RS 0.5.430.
And that's not just an old finding, right?
Yeah, a more recent analysis, I think it was Hindustan Times in 2023, confirmed it. Muslims had the lowest levels of assets and also consumption. Their consumption was about 88% of the all-India average, and assets even lower, like 79%.
And doesn't the UN's poverty measure, the MPI, show something similar?
It does. The Multidimensional Poverty Index indicated a higher poverty rate for Muslims, around 33% compared to, say, 15% for upper castes. It suggests deprivation across multiple dimensions, not just income.
So what are the potential reasons floated in the sources? Is it similar to the caste discussion, discrimination, limited opportunities?
That's often part of the discussion, yes. Factors like potential discrimination in education, in the job market, maybe difficulties accessing finance or credit. It paints a picture of socioeconomic marginalization.
Yeah, shifting gears a bit, something I found quite surprising was how households actually spend their money, specifically the amount going towards religious activities.
Ah, yes. That Liveman article from 2016, it was pretty eye-opening. Rural household spending, on average, 9% of their consumer services budget on religious activities.
9%. And how did that compare to other essentials?
Well, the comparison they made was stark. Sanitation spending in those same rural households, just 0.22%.
Wow, 9% versus 0.22%.
Exactly. Even in urban areas, it was significant. 5.7% on religious activities compared to 0.45% on sanitation.
That really makes you pause, doesn't it?
Yes.
Especially when you consider limited budgets.
It does. And what was maybe even more striking was that even the poorest 20% in rural areas were still allocating around 7% of their services spending to religious activities.
7% for the poorest group.
Yeah.
Could that level of spending potentially divert funds from other critical things, like health or education?
That's the million-repeat question, isn't it? If resources are tight and a noticeable chunk goes to religious activities, it could mean less is available for nutrition, healthcare, schooling, things essential for, getting out of poverty.
It raises questions about perceived value and maybe trade-offs, conscious or not.
Definitely. It's about understanding priorities within different communities.
Okay, so that's spending money.
Yeah.
We also looked at how people spend their time, right? Based on the NSSO Time Use Survey from 2019.
Yes, there were discussions around that data suggesting some differences. It seems Christians and Muslims, on average, tend to spend more time on religious activities compared to Hindus and Sikhs.
You mean like daily prayers or weekly services adding up?
Precisely. Things like daily namaz in Islam or regular church attendance for Christians often involve a greater cumulative time commitment.
But here's the twist, isn't it? More time on religion didn't automatically mean lower economic status across the board.
Exactly. That was the interesting part. Christians, for instance, who report relatively high religious time engagement, generally had a higher per capita spending in urban areas than Muslims, who also reported high engagement.
So spending more time on religious practices doesn't directly correlate with being poor.
It appears not, or at least it's not a simple one-to-one relationship. It suggests that while religious norms definitely shape time use, other factors, education quality, job opportunities, social networks, discrimination, are likely much bigger drivers of economic outcomes.
Right. It shows the complexity again. It's not just one single factor.
Not at all.
Okay, now let's tread carefully into maybe the most debated area. The idea that specific cultural or religious beliefs might influence economic behavior.
Right, this is where things get really nuanced. We're talking about concepts sometimes brought up like fatalism, or the emphasis in some Hindu philosophies on karma or detachment from worldly things.
The argument being that these beliefs might make people less focused on, say, accumulating wealth.
That's the argument some people make, yes. But, and this is a huge but, you absolutely have to weigh that against the massive impact of concrete historical economic policies.
Like the license Raj.
Exactly. The whole license permit quota Raj era heavily restricted private business for decades. Think about car production being limited to just 2 companies for 40 years. That choked economic activity regardless of anyone's personal beliefs about karma.
So trying to separate the influence of belief from the influence of policy is tricky.
Incredibly tricky. Almost impossible, perhaps. And then there was the other study we saw mentioned in India Development Review.
Ah, yes, the one linking secularization and economic growth.
Right, drawing on research published in Science Advances, it noted India's very high levels of religiosity, over 90% saying religion was very important back in 2014.
And it suggested
What?
a potential economic boost if India became more secular.
It posited a correlation, suggesting that if India's level of secularization were to, say, match Western Europe's, its GDP per capita could potentially jump significantly over 30 years, from around $1975 in 2018 to maybe $5,000.
That's a big hypothetical leap.
It is, and it's crucial to remember correlation isn't causation. There are countless differences between India and Western Europe besides secularization levels.
Sure.
But, it does make you think about possible macro-level links between prevailing cultural values and economic development, even if it's just a correlation.
But we have to keep coming back to the more grounded factors, too.
Absolutely. We can't lose sight of the impact of those historical economic choices, ongoing social inequalities, discrimination based on caste or religion, and just fundamental access or lack of access to decent education and healthcare.
These are still the massive elephants in the room when we talk about poverty.
Without a doubt. And to be fair, government initiatives exist, things like MG and Rajise for rural jobs or Swachh Bharat for sanitation. They are trying to tackle these issues directly.
Right, acknowledging the need for systemic action.
Exactly. Even if the cultural and religious dimensions are harder to address through policy alone.
So as we sort of wrap this up, the picture that emerges is definitely not simple. It's this tangled web, isn't it?
It really is. You've got the enduring legacy of the caste system. You have these economic gaps linked to religious identity. You have questions about how households use their resources, including for religion.
Then you have these debated ideas about cultural beliefs, all overlaid by the huge impact of broader economic policies and social structures.
Precisely. It tells us that tackling poverty effectively in India probably needs a really comprehensive approach.
Something that looks at cultural norms and discrimination, but also pushes hard on systemic reforms for inclusive growth and, genuinely equal opportunities.
Couldn't agree more. It needs to work on multiple fronts simultaneously.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener. Thinking about everything we've dug into today, caste, religion, spending, time use, beliefs, economic structures, if you could wave a magic wand and make just one single change, what do you think would have the biggest impact on reducing poverty in India? And critically, why that specific change?
That's a tough one. Something to really mull over. We hope this deep dive gave you some food for thought.
Thanks for joining us.